When dusk settles over Washington, D.C., the marble dome of the United States Capitol glows like a lantern above the city. Tourists photograph its silhouette against the autumn sky. Schoolchildren press their faces to the railings and learn the names of lawgivers and landmark votes. On the surface, the building is a monument to democracy, open, public, ceremonial. But deep beneath that same marble and mortar, there runs another story. A quiet, mechanical, and carefully concealed network of passageways and chambers that were designed not for spectators, but for survival. This is the story of a tunnel. Not a subway, not a utility corridor, but an emergency escape route fashioned in wartime fear and kept in bureaucratic silence for decades. It is a story that threads together presidential anxieties, military planning, surveillance paranoia, and the secret machinery of government. It is a story about what a nation hides beneath its public face when it believes its very heart is vulnerable. In the winter of 1941 and the months that followed Pearl Harbor, America moved as a country into a kind of defensive choreography. Naval yards emptied into convoys, factories retooled overnight, and in rooms with closed doors and private telephones, decisions were made about the survival of government itself. The fear was not only of invasion of land or sea, but of swift and shocking strikes on the centers of national command and the potential decapitation of leadership. The answer, at least in Washington, came in steel, concrete, and secrecy. Engineers, military planners, and civil servants conceived a subterranean countermeasure, a planned system of corridors and protected chambers that could move the president and lawmakers out of reach, or at least give them time and shelter to coordinate a response. Civilians and laborers drafted, dug, and cemented under the bright public face of Capitol Hill. Contractors were told to expand utilities or to repair old basements, terms that made the work routine and unremarkable. But beneath the surface, an emergency relocation architecture was taking shape. Tunnels leading away from the Capitol dome, fortified rooms fitted for communications and command, and a route intended to link legislative authority with other secure points across the seat of government. The project was not, and this is important, the product of a single afternoon's panic. It was the product of months of contingency planning that intensified after December 7, 1941. Officials in the executive and legislative branches debated what leadership continuity should mean in the face of a major assault. Could the nation's command survive a loss of Washington? If not, could the government at least survive a hit to its most visible institutions? Could the president and members of Congress be evacuated discreetly without precipitating mass confusion, panic, or political collapse? The answers led to an array of measures big and small. Among these was the so-called Capitol Escape Project, a set of engineered pathways and hidden rooms beneath the hill intended for wartime use. To understand why such a project was conceivable and why it remained secretive long after the war ended, one must accept a basic truth. Governments build more than monuments. They build redundancy. They build redundancy in places that ordinary citizens rarely imagine. Walking through the halls of the Capitol during those years, you would find an ordinary face to everything. Legislative aides took notes. Lobbyists made their rounds. Yet under the feet of the unremarkable everyday flowed the skeletal bones of something else. Iron-reinforced tunnels, ventilation shafts cleverly disguised, and heavy doors that could be closed and sealed. Some of these corridors were adjacent to known service tunnels, others were carved into the rock and clay beneath the hill, hidden behind false walls and access panels. The workforce that assembled the tunnels was astonishingly ordinary. Bricklayers and carpenters, electricians and plumbers, many of whom possessed only the pay grade of skilled laborers, were told to do work categorized as utility improvements. Their payroll records and shift logs listed innocuous tasks: patching, rewiring, and expanding basement storerooms. Few, if any, were told that their chisels and shovels and welding torches were helping assemble an escape route intended for the management of a national crisis. That culture of compartmentalization was deliberate. Secrecy built on everyday normalcy. The tunnels themselves were not all the same. Some sections were narrow and functional, corridors designed for quick movement, lined with conduit and lighting and occasional bunks. Other parts were more elaborate, small chambers intended as communications hubs, rooms fitted with switchboards, and if the accounts that survived are to be believed, a central command chamber equipped with hardened radio equipment. This room, in design, was built to be a pocket headquarters, a place where a president or cabinet official could step down, take command, and maintain lines of contact to military leaders and allied cities. Those who recall the era say that the appearance of the tunnels was unremarkable in its pragmatism. Concrete floor, steel-reinforced walls, painted ventilation ducts. There were heavy doors that could be trucked closed and sealed. There were also redundancies, secondary routes, sidings where visitors could be turned away, and sections of pipework designed to obscure the sound of boots or humming equipment. Over time, layers of official terminology became attached to these places. Shelter zones, emergency routing, relocation corridors, language that made the extraordinary sound bureaucratic and safe.
But the tunnels took on a particular urgency in 1943. Intelligence reports, the cautious whisper of diplomatic cables, and the changing shape of the conflict in Europe and the Pacific all suggested that the war might not remain neatly separated from the homeland. The possibility of foreign sabotage, of special operations teams, or a sudden strike on Washington became tangible enough to mandate new action. Smaller, secretive investments were made to upgrade existing corridors. Steel bulkheads were reinforced. Ventilation systems were sealed and outfitted with filtration. Communications equipment that had once been the size of a room now fit into racks with the faint hum of vacuum tubes and early transceivers. In certain quarters, the tunnels were retrofitted into something that more closely resembled a modern continuity of government complex. The tunnel's purpose, always dual, was equally defensive and symbolic. On one hand, they were a practical plan to preserve leadership command and the continuity of law. On the other hand, they represented a psychological bulwark. If Washington could not be easily disrupted, allies and citizens could be reassured that the American government would persevere. The existence of such a route was intended to be a quiet confidence, not a public boast. Yet secrecy breeds rumor. The curiosity of construction crews, the occasional misstep by a junior official, and the human tendency to fill blanks in a story with more dramatic conjecture all conspired to create myths about the tunnels. Some stories claimed that the tunnel ran all the way to Fort McNair, or the White House. Others insisted there were hidden caches of weapons or even armored vehicles stashed beneath the hill. A few journalists decades later would pry at official statements and unearth fragments of documentation that lent credence to parts of those tales. References to protected routing, to continuity measures, and to occasional maintenance operations in the basement levels of major federal buildings. By the time the Cold War dawned, the tunnels had been folded into another layer of national security habit. The fear of nuclear attack, the new weight of airborne surveillance, and the expanding complexity of communications raised new questions. Where once the primary threat might have been sabotage or a localized assault, now it was the specter of long-range missiles and radiation. Continuity planners thus had to consider whether sub-basements and modest tunnels could provide protection against a very different kind of weapon. In some instances, the tunnels were retrofitted again. In others, they were cataloged and archived as part of a larger inventory of continuity of government assets. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 brought the issue back into sharp relief. During those tense days when the world hovered near the edge of nuclear exchange, officials in Washington invoked contingency plans with a crispness that bordered on the mechanical. Movement, routing, and protected communication were no longer hypothetical. In the Capitol's back corridors, teams rehearsed procedures. Access hatches were tested. The kind of drills that had been planned in wartime found their use again, albeit with new parameters. Not every element of these subterranean measures remained active forever. Over decades, some passages were sealed with concrete, old doors welded shut, and documentation was declassified only in fragments. Official explanations often neutralized the myth-making: utility tunnels, maintenance corridors, old sub-basements. Each phrase a way of explaining the visible hole in public knowledge without explaining the whole. Yet for a curious historian or an old electrician who had scraped a hand on the ironwork and remembered being told only that it was a repair job, glimpses of a larger plan persisted as stories told over coffee and in the dim light of evening. Artifacts from those years have been uncovered in fits and starts. During renovation work on the Capitol Visitors Center in the 1980s and early 2000s, contractors reported discovering older brick-lined tunnels, rusting bolts, and, in certain places, old telegraph panels disconnected and retired. Maps surfaced in archive rooms that showed dotted lines under the hill, connecting buildings that, on the surface, seemed only loosely related. Worn switchboards and early transceivers were cataloged and placed in vaults. A few oral histories of security men, maintenance foremen, and clerks gave voice to a prudence that had been practiced for decades. Those oral histories described midnight work crews and coded instruction slips, a level of secrecy that felt at once antiseptic and oddly intimate. So why then did the tunnels fade from public attention? One reason is bureaucratic inertia. Once a utility routing serves its purpose, it is either maintained quietly or it becomes a curiosity closed off by paperwork. Another is political perception. Public leaders did not benefit from broadcasting schemes that admitted their vulnerability. And finally, history moved forward. Wars ended, new threats emerged, technologies changed the nature of command and control. As radio gave way to digital networks, as airborne defense changed, the form of continuity did too. Still, the tunnels never wholly disappeared from institutional memory. In moments of crisis, the country's inventory of contingency plans has traditionally been pulled from an archival sleeve and dusted off. Emergency routing, shelter plans, and secure communications have been reevaluated and at times incrementally modernized. The mythology of the tunnel gave it an afterlife, a combination of practical redundancy and symbolic reassurance, a subterranean whisper that the government had thought about survival. The story of the Capitol Tunnel is more than a tale of bricks and blueprints. It is a story about the invisible architecture of trust, the tacit agreement that the engines of governance must be protected from sudden disruption. It is about the smaller, human details that make national systems work, the sheet metal worker who sealed a hatch, the clerk who misfiled a note in a ledger, the captain who practiced a drill at dusk and then went home to a quiet family dinner. Those details humanize a story that might otherwise be imagined in only terms of strategy and statute. Today, when visitors walk the Capitol's marble halls, they do so under the long shadow of that history. Few will know the places that lie several levels below, where the air smells faintly of concrete and old insulation, where a rusted switch might still be found behind false paneling, where a corridor once intended to whisk leaders to safety waits, perhaps, for a time it was never meant to meet. The tunnel is a reminder that the institutions we take for granted have been defended in ways both visible and invisible, and that national resilience is often a matter of quiet preparation. In the end, the secret tunnel beneath the Capitol is an artifact of a particular historical moment, a mix of fear, precaution, and engineering that sought to preserve the nation's voice as bombs fell overseas. It stands now as memory, partly archived, partly rumor, partly physical remains, and as an emblem of the lengths to which a democracy will sometimes go to protect the continuity of its government. When history asks hard questions, it often finds its answers in unexpected places, under the seats of power, carved in concrete, behind heavy iron doors that creak with the weight of the past. If there is a lesson here, it is this. Architecture can be a kind of memory. It stores not only the record of decisions, but the anxiety that produced them. Beneath Washington's ceremonial spaces, a subterranean network once prepared to ferry leaders in a time of peril. Whether it remains sealed or dormant, or in active, modernized use, is a matter for archivists and security officers and busy men in gray suits. But the existence of such a route tells us that when nations are frightened, they often reach for the tools of permanence. Places where actions can be sheltered, words can keep traveling, and decisions can be made. And for those who walk on the grass over the hill, or who look up at the Capitol lighted at dusk, it is worth remembering that beneath the visible order of democracy, there is a shadowed infrastructure, a story carved in stone, hidden in ducts, waiting to be read by those who know how to look.